Few days later, the penthouse felt different, lighter somehow, like a held breath finally released. Zara caught herself smiling at nothing, humming while she made tea, and twice she looked up to find Min-ho watching her with an expression she couldn't name, something between disbelief and hunger, like a man who couldn't quite trust that the good thing in front of him was real. Staring, she said one morning, not looking up from her sketchbook. "I'm allowed, you're my wife. 6 months. We are renegotiating that clause," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough to count as one from him. She laughed, and the sound seemed to do something to him every time, made his shoulders drop half an inch, made the perpetual tension around his eyes ease. She was starting to understand that Kang Min-ho had spent so many years being feared that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be simply, uncomplicatedly happy. She was starting to understand that she wanted to be the reason he remembered. That evening he told her about the wedding. "A real one," he said carefully, like he was diffusing something. "Public, my board expects it, given the circumstances of our marriage becoming more permanent, it would also protect you. A public wife is a claimed wife. Fewer people test what's mine when the whole city has seen the ring." "You make it sound so romantic," Zara said dryly, but her chest was tight with something warmer than sarcasm. "I can do romantic," he said, and reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box he'd clearly been carrying around for longer than he wanted to admit. Inside was a ring, understated, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry she'd expected from a man of his wealth. "I had it made, not the ring from the contract. This one's mine to give you." Her eyes strung. "Min-ho, you don't have to say yes to the ceremony," he said quickly, misreading her silence. "I just wanted you to have something that was real regardless." "I'm saying yes," she said, voice thick. "To all of it." He kissed her then, slow and certain, and for one golden stretch of days it seemed like the hardest part of their story was already behind them. They were wrong. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later, a lavish affair at the Grand Hanel Hotel that Min-ho's PR team assembled with the terrifying efficiency of people used to controlling narratives. Zara found herself swept into fittings and florists, and a whirlwind of decisions she'd never imagined making, all while trying to hold on to the quiet, private version of her marriage that had nothing to do with cameras or board approval. It was at the final dress fitting, 2 weeks before the ceremony, that the first real threat arrived, not as an explosion or a gunshot, but as an envelope, cream-colored and elegant, delivered to her hotel suite with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Min-ho, years younger, standing close beside a striking woman in a red dress, both of them laughing at something outside frame. On the back, in careful handwriting, were 4 words. "Ask him about Serin." Zara didn't ask him. Not right away. She carried the photograph with her for 2 days, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a bruise to see how much it still hurts, before Min-ho found her staring at it in the quiet of their bedroom. "Where did you get that?" His voice had gone very still, very careful, the voice she now recognized as the one he used when something frightened him. "Someone sent it to me, anonymously." She held his gaze. "Who is she?" He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yoo Serin, she was." He stopped, started again. 6 years ago I was engaged to her. Arranged mostly, but I convinced myself it could become something real if I tried hard enough. Then my father was killed, and the emperor fell to me overnight, and Serin decided a man drowning in enemies wasn't worth the risk to her family's reputation. She left 3 days before the wedding. Now she's sending me photographs," he said grimly. "She's realized I've married someone else, publicly, happily, and her pride cannot survive that." He took Zara's hands in both of his. "She is dangerous, Zara, not because she loves me, because she resents that I moved on without her and people like that do not let go quietly." "How dangerous?" "Her family still has connections to people I've spent years trying to cut out of my organization. If she wants to hurt you to hurt me, she has the means to try." Zara felt cold despite the warmth of his hands around hers. "Then we tell your security, we prepare." "I already have," he said. "I doubled your detail this morning the second I heard she'd resurfaced in the city." His jaw tightened. "I should have told you the moment I knew. I didn't want to frighten you before the wedding." "I would rather be frightened and prepared than protected and blind," she said. "Don't do that again. Don't decide what I can handle without asking me." "Understood," he said quietly, and meant it. By the following week, the danger had gone from a photograph in an envelope to something Zara could feel following her, a black car that appeared too often on her route to the florist, a man who lingered too long outside the hotel gym she used in the mornings. Min-ho's men were everywhere now, quiet, watchful, and it should have made her feel safer. Mostly it made the wedding feel like a countdown to something worse than nerves. The night before the ceremony, Zara couldn't sleep. She found Min-ho on the balcony, exactly where she always found him when the weight of his world got too heavy to carry sitting down. Second thoughts. he asked without turning around, though there was something raw underneath the question, like he was bracing for the answer. Never, she said, coming to stand beside him. I was thinking about Serin. His shoulders tensed. She won't ruin tomorrow, I've made sure of it. That's not what worries me. Zara looked out at the city lights, the same skyline that had felt so foreign 3 months ago and now somehow felt like home. I keep thinking about what she must have felt, walking away from you when things got hard, and I keep thinking that I understand it a little. Loving someone in your world means loving someone who could disappear, who could be taken, who could bleed out in front of you because of a shipment or a rival or a grudge 6 years old. She wasn't strong enough for that fear. I'm terrified I won't be either. Min-ho turned to face her fully, both hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that had never once matched his reputation. You already are, he said. You stayed after you saw the blood on my shirt. You stayed after you learned what my world costs. Serin left because she wanted safety without sacrifice. You've never once asked me to be smaller or softer than I am. You just asked me to let you stand beside me instead of behind me. His thumb traced her cheekbone. That is the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me, Zara. Don't compare yourself to a woman who ran, you're the one who stayed. She turned her face into his palm, breathing him in, letting the fear settle into something steadier. I love you, she said, the words slipping out plain and unguarded, the first time either of them had said it aloud. Something broke open across his face, relief and disbelief and joy tangled together. Say it again. I love you, Kang Min-ho. I love you, he said back, rough and immediate, like he'd been holding the words for weeks and finally had permission to let them go. More than the empire, more than the name, more than anything I was ever taught to value before you. Wedding, when it came, was everything the first ceremony hadn't been, full of light and music and 400 guests who watched Zara walk down an aisle of white orchids in a gown that made Min-ho's carefully composed face crack into open, unguarded wonder. Her father cried through the entire thing. Min-ho's hands were steady this time, sure of every word he said, and when he slid the second ring onto her finger, his voice didn't waver once. I, Kang Min-ho, choose you, Zara, not out of contract, not out of convenience, but because you walked into my ruins and decided to stay and build something anyway. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. There was not a dry eye in the ballroom, and for one perfect golden hour, it seemed like the danger following them had finally been outrun. Then, during the reception, Zara excused herself to the powder room and never came back. Min-ho noticed within 4 minutes the length of time it took for a father-daughter dance segment to end, and for him to realize his wife's chair was still empty. 4 minutes felt like nothing until you multiplied it by the terror of a man who had spent his whole life anticipating exactly this kind of catastrophe. He found the powder room empty except for a single dropped earring, and a note taped to the mirror in handwriting he recognized instantly, careful and elegant and cruel. You should have chosen me. Now you get to choose which one of us you save first, your bride or your business. Choose wrong and you lose both. As the reception dissolved into chaos as Min-ho's calm shattered for the first time in years, his voice ringing through the ballroom in commands that sent security scrambling, his face gone white with a fury so cold it silenced the entire room. Find her, he said to his head of security, Park Dong-woo, voice shaking with restrained violence. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who we have to go through. Find my wife. It took 6 brutal hours, 6 hours of Min-ho tearing through every resource his empire possessed, calling in favors from rival families who owed him debts they'd rather not repay, threatening business partners into surrendering surveillance footage, standing in the center of his war room with his jaw locked and his hands curled into fists because it was the only way to keep them from shaking. They found her in a warehouse on the industrial edge of Incheon, in a room with one bare bulb and Serin sitting across from her, sipping tea like they were old friends catching up instead of captor and captive. He's coming, Zara said, wrists bound but chin lifted, refusing to give Serin the satisfaction of fear. You know that, right? You know there's nowhere in this country you can hide from him now. He'll come, Serin agreed, unbothered. That's rather the point. I want him to watch what happens to the woman who replaced me. You didn't get replaced, Zara said. You left. There's a difference between losing something and throwing it away. Serin's calm cracked, just slightly, the teacup clinking too hard against the saucer. You don't know anything about what I sacrificed. I know you're sitting in a warehouse plotting revenge against a man who's clearly built an entire life without you, Zara said, voice steady even as her pulse hammered. That's not the behavior of someone who's moved on. That's the behavior of someone who's still bleeding from a wound she gave herself. The slap came fast, sharp across Zara's cheek, and for a moment the room went white with pain and shock. But she didn't cry. She'd spent a lifetime absorbing her father's failures without breaking. She wasn't about to break for a woman drowning in her own bitterness. You should be terrified of me, Serin hissed. I'm not, Zara said and meant it, because somewhere in the last 3 months she had stopped being the woman who folded under pressure and started being the woman Min-ho believed she already was. The warehouse door exploded inward 20 minutes later, not with gunfire, but with the sheer, controlled fury of Kang Min-ho walking through it, flanked by a dozen armed men, his eyes locking on the mark forming on his wife's cheek with a violence that made even Serin's hired guards step back. Min-ho, Serin started, rising, some old, desperate hope still flickering in her voice. Don't, he said, and the single word carried more danger than any threat she could have manufactured. He crossed the room, cut the ties binding Zara's wrists with his own hands, careful and fast, checking every inch of her for injuries with a barely restrained tremor. Are you hurt, Zara? Look at me. Are you hurt? I'm okay, she said, and the relief that broke across his face nearly undid him. He turned to Serin, and the temperature in the room dropped to something arctic. You had 6 years to move on from a decision you made yourself. Instead, you touched what's mine. His voice was quiet, which made it worse. I built an empire on knowing exactly how to make people regret their mistakes. You're about to learn that firsthand. Min-ho, please, take her, he said to his men, not even looking at her anymore, already turning back to Zara like Serin had ceased to exist the moment his wife was safe. Hand her to the authorities. Every charge that applies. I want this handled through the law, not through anything darker, because my wife deserves to see me choose to be better than my worst instincts, even tonight. He gathered Zara into his arms, and she finally let herself shake, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once, replaced by the overwhelming relief of his heartbeat steady and close against her ear. Got you, he murmured into her hair. I've got you, you're safe, I'm never letting you out of my sight again. That sounds excessive, she said, voice muffled and a little wet. Earn the right to be excessive tonight, he said, and she laughed, shaky and disbelieving, because somehow, impossibly, they had survived it. Serin's family severed ties with her within the week. Unwilling to be associated with kidnapping charges, and the very public collapse of a woman who had let bitterness consume every rational instinct she had left. The story made headlines for exactly 1 news cycle before Min-ho's PR team buried it beneath the far more appealing story of a mafia king who had torn the city apart to save his bride. A story that only deepened public fascination with the woman who had tamed Seoul's most feared man. By the end of that month, they finally left for the honeymoon that had been delayed by chaos, a private island off the coast of Jeju where the only security required was distance and silence. Zara stood on the beach at sunset, sand between her toes, watching the man who had once been a stranger buying her silence now wadding into the shallow water like a boy instead of an empire. You look happy, she called out. I'm happy, he said, turning back to her, water dripping from rolled-up trousers, hair mussed by the wind, more unguarded than she had ever seen him. I didn't know I was allowed to be before you. She walked into the water to meet him, and he pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers the way he had that first night the walls between them finally came down. 6 months, she said softly. That's what we agreed to. I believe we renegotiated that clause. Did, she agreed, smiling against his mouth. Indefinitely. 1 year later, the penthouse that had once felt like glass and steel and careful, guarded silence had become something entirely different, warm with the sound of laughter, filled with the small chaos of a life built on choice instead of contract. Zara stood in the nursery they'd finished decorating just weeks before, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, watching the sunset paint the Seoul skyline gold through the window. Min-ho found her there the way he always did, drawn to wherever she was like something magnetic and permanent. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his hands gently over hers on the swell of their unborn child. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Any of it? The debt, the contract, the danger? Zara turned in his arms to face him, the man who had once bought her silence and instead given her a life she had never dared to dream of. I would sign that contract again 1,000 times, she said, if it meant ending up exactly here. He kissed her slowly, like a vow renewed, like a promise that had already been kept and would be kept again every day after. Outside, Seoul glittered on, indifferent to the quiet miracle happening 38 floors above its streets, a marriage that began in lies and ended in a truth neither of them had been brave enough to hope for until they found it in each other. And that was how Kang Min-ho, the most feared man in South Korea, finally understood that the greatest empire he would ever build was not made of ports or shadows or fear, but of one woman who had refused to leave when leaving would have been easier, and the family they built together in the light she had brought into his darkness. If this story moved you, please like, share and subscribe to Afro K Love Diaries and tell me in the comments, would you have signed the contract or would you have walked away? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single one. See you in the next story.